Before Britain, the tribal kingdoms that fought Rome long before Britain had kings and queens. Before castles rose and knights rode in shining armor, the island was ruled by warriors. Not one country, but dozens of tribes, each with its own leaders, gods, and rivalries. Some welcomed Rome, others waged war with everything they had. When Julius Caesar first set foot on British shores in 55 BCE, he didn't encounter a unified nation ready to bow before Roman eagles. Instead, he faced a patchwork of fierce tribal kingdoms, each as different from one another as they were united in their suspicion of foreign invaders. These weren't primitive savages living in mud huts, as Roman propaganda would later suggest. These were sophisticated societies with complex political structures, advanced extensive trade networks, and warrior cultures that would give Rome some of its bloodiest battles. The Celtic tribes of Britain had been developing their distinct identities for centuries. Before Rome ever cast its hungry gaze across the English Channel, they were the descendants of waves of Celtic migration that had swept across Europe, bringing with them ironworking technology, distinctive art styles, and social structures built around kinship, honor, and martial prowess. By the time Caesar arrived, these tribes had evolved into dozens of separate kingdoms, each controlling territory that could span hundreds of square miles and encompass tens of thousands of people. The Catuvillani dominated much of what we now call southeastern England, their territory stretching across modern-day Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire, and parts of surrounding counties. They were perhaps the most politically sophisticated of all the British tribes, with a complex hierarchy of nobles, warriors, craftsmen, and farmers. Their capital at Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, was a thriving urban centre, with impressive earthwork fortifications, workshops producing high-quality metalwork and pottery, and evidence of extensive trade connections reaching as far as the Mediterranean. The Catuvillani had developed a monetary system using beautifully crafted gold and silver coins, many bearing the names and images of their kings, demonstrating a level of political organization that rivaled many continental European societies. Under leaders like Cassivellaunus, who led the resistance against Caesar's invasions, and later Cunobelinus, who Shakespeare would immortalize as Cymbeline, the Catuvillani proved themselves master diplomats and strategists. They understood that survival in the complex world of intertribal politics required not just military strength, but also the ability to forge alliances, manage trade relationships, and adapt to changing circumstances. When Cunobelinus ruled in the early 1st century CE, he managed to extend Catuvillanian influence over neighboring tribes through a combination of military pressure, political marriages, and economic incentives, creating something approaching a proto-state in southeastern Britain. To the north, the Brigantes controlled the largest territory of any British tribe, their lands stretching across much of what is now northern England, from the Pennines to the Scottish borders. The Brigantes were not a single unified people, but rather a confederation of smaller tribes and clans, who had banded together under the leadership of powerful war chiefs. Their society was built around cattle raising and hill-fort settlements, with impressive fortified sites like Stanwick in North Yorkshire, serving as centres of power and refuge during times of conflict. The most famous of the Brigantian leaders was Queen Cartimandua, a ruler whose political acumen and controversial decisions would shape the course of Roman conquest in northern Britain. Cartimandua understood better than most that the arrival of Rome represented both an existential threat and a potential opportunity. Rather than immediately resort to warfare, she chose the path of diplomacy, becoming a client ruler under Roman protection. This decision was deeply controversial among her own people, many of whom viewed any accommodation with Rome as betrayal of their ancestral freedoms. Cartamandua's political maneuvering became even more complex when she was faced with the arrival of the Cativalonian prince, who had become the most prominent leader of British resistance to Rome. After years of guerrilla warfare against the Roman legions, Caratacus had fled to Brigantian territory, seeking sanctuary and hoping to convince Cartamandua to join the anti-Roman coalition. Instead, in a move that shocked the Celtic world, Cartamandua had Caratacus arrested and handed him over to the Romans in chains. This act of betrayal, as many saw it, earned her Roman favor, but also sparked a civil war within her own kingdom, as her husband Venutius led a faction of Brigantes, who refused to accept Roman domination. The internal strife among the Brigantes illustrates one of the fundamental challenges facing all British tribes in the face of Roman expansion: the question of whether resistance or accommodation offered the better path to survival. Some leaders, like Cartamandua, believed that working within the Roman system offered the best hope of preserving, at least, some measure of autonomy and protecting their people from the devastating consequences of military defeat. Others, like Venutius and the many warriors who followed him, believed that freedom was worth any sacrifice, and that submission to Rome meant the death of everything that made their culture worth preserving. In the east, the Iceni occupied the fertile lands of what is now Norfolk and parts of Suffolk and Cambridgeshire. The Iceni had initially chosen the path of accommodation with Rome, becoming a client kingdom under their king Prasutagus. This arrangement allowed them to maintain their internal autonomy, while accepting Roman oversight of their external relations. For a time, this seemed to work well for both parties. The Iceni continued to mint their own coins, maintain their own laws and customs, and govern themselves according to traditional Celtic practices, while Rome gained a buffer state and ally in a strategically important region. However, the death of Prasutagus in 60 CE exposed the fundamental instability of these client relationships. According to his will, Prasutagus had left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor, hoping this arrangement would protect his family and people. Instead, Roman officials used his death as an opportunity to effectively annex Iceni territory, seizing property, enslaving nobles, and treating the former client kingdom as conquered territory. When Prasutagus's widow, Queen Boudica, protested these actions, she was publicly flogged, and her daughters were raped by Roman soldiers. These outrages sparked what would become the most serious rebellion Rome faced in Britain. Boudica's revolt was not simply a spontaneous explosion of anger, but a carefully coordinated uprising that drew support from multiple tribes who had grown disillusioned with Roman rule. The Trinovantes, who had seen their sacred groves destroyed and their lands confiscated to make room for Roman veterans, joined the rebellion enthusiastically. Other tribes throughout eastern and central Britain contributed warriors to Boudica's army, creating a coalition that represented the largest unified British resistance to Roman rule. The rebellion's early successes were spectacular and terrifying. Boudica's forces completely destroyed Camulodunum, slaughtering the Roman colonists and their British collaborators with a savagery that shocked even hardened Roman veterans. They then marched on Londinium, the growing commercial centre that represented everything many Britons hated about Roman rule: the displacement of traditional ways of life by foreign customs, the exploitation of British resources for Roman benefit, and the arrogance of occupiers who treated native peoples as inferior beings, fit only for slavery or taxation. The destruction of Londinium was followed by the sack of Verulamium, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that Boudica's coalition might actually succeed in driving Rome from Britain entirely. Roman historians claimed that over 70,000 Romans and British collaborators were killed during the rebellion, and the ferocity of the British attacks had clearly shaken Roman confidence. However, the ultimate failure of Boudica's revolt also demonstrated the limitations of tribal warfare. When faced with the disciplined professionalism of Roman military organization, the final battle between Boudica's forces and the Roman army under Suetonius Paulinus illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Celtic military culture. The British warriors fought with tremendous courage and individual skill, but their forces lacked the discipline and coordination that made Roman legions so effective. Celtic warfare was built around individual heroism, clan loyalties, and the inspiration of charismatic leaders, but these same qualities that made Celtic warriors so formidable in small-scale conflicts became when facing the systematic tactics of professional soldiers. The defeat of Boudica's rebellion marked a turning point in Romano-British relations, but it did not end tribal resistance to Roman rule. In Wales, the Silures and Ordivices continued to wage guerrilla warfare from their mountain strongholds for decades after Boudica's death. These tribes had developed military tactics perfectly suited to their terrain, using their knowledge of local geography to launch surprise attacks on Roman supply lines and isolated garrisons before melting back into the hills and forests, where heavily armored legionaries could not effectively pursue them. The Silures, in particular, became legendary for their stubborn resistance to Roman conquest. Based in the mountainous regions of what is now South Wales, they had developed a warrior culture that emphasized mobility, stealth, and intimate knowledge of the landscape. Their society was organized around small, tightly knit war bands that could strike quickly and disappear before Roman forces could respond effectively. The Romans found these tactics incredibly frustrating, as they were accustomed to facing enemies who would meet them in open battle. Where Roman discipline and equipment provided clear advantages, the Ordivices of North Wales proved equally troublesome for Roman commanders. Their territory in the mountains of Snowdonia provided natural fortresses that were almost impossible to assault directly, and their warriors had perfected the art of ambush warfare. Roman columns moving through narrow mountain passes were vulnerable to attacks from above, where Celtic warriors could rain down spears and stones before vanishing into terrain that Roman soldiers, weighed down by heavy armor and equipment, could not hope to navigate effectively. The persistence of Welsh resistance forced Rome to commit substantial military resources to campaigns that often produced limited results. The conquest of Wales required not just military victory but also the systematic destruction of the Druids, the Celtic priestly class that provided much of the ideological foundation for resistance to Roman rule. The Druids maintained sacred groves and centres of learning throughout Celtic Britain, but their most important sanctuary was on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, off the coast of Wales. The Roman assault on Mona in 60 CE was as much a religious war as a military campaign. The Druids represented everything that Rome found threatening about Celtic culture. They maintained oral traditions that preserved pre-Roman history and law. They conducted religious ceremonies that Romans found barbaric and threatening, and they provided a source of authority that competed with Roman claims to legitimacy. The destruction of the Druidic sanctuary on Mona was intended to break the spiritual backbone of Celtic resistance, and in many ways it succeeded. And tribal leaders found ways to maintain their authority by accepting Roman titles and working within Roman administrative structures. However, the elimination of formal Druidic authority did not immediately end the cultural and religious traditions that sustained tribal identity throughout Britain. Many tribes managed to preserve elements of their pre-Roman culture by adapting them to fit within the framework of Roman rule. Celtic gods were identified with Roman deities. Traditional festivals were reinterpreted as Roman celebrations. The Dobony of the Cotswolds and the Durotriges of Dorset represent examples of tribes that managed this transition with varying degrees of success. The Dobony, who controlled territory in what is now Gloucestershire and surrounding areas, had established trade relationships with Rome even before the conquest, and their leaders were generally able to maintain their positions by accepting Roman oversight. The Geretrages, however, had built their society around impressive hill forts, like Maiden Castle, and their resistance to Roman rule was fierce and prolonged. The siege of Maiden Castle provides one of the most dramatic examples of the clash between Celtic and Roman military cultures. The massive earthwork fortifications that protected this Durotrigan stronghold represented centuries of development in Celtic defensive architecture, with multiple rings of ditches and ramparts that should have been nearly impregnable to direct assault. However, Roman siege techniques, including the use of ballista artillery and systematic engineering approaches to breaching fortifications, proved capable of overcoming even the most impressive Celtic defences. Archaeological evidence from Maiden Castle tells a story of desperate resistance and ultimate defeat. Skeletons found in the fort's cemetery show evidence of horrific wounds inflicted by Roman weapons, including ballista bolts that had penetrated deep into warriors' bodies. The discovery of a British warrior buried with a Roman ballista bolt still embedded in his spine provides a poignant reminder of the human cost of these conflicts and the courage of defenders who continued fighting even when facing overwhelming technological disadvantages. The gradual pacification of the British tribes did not mean the complete disappearance of tribal identity or culture. Many aspects of Celtic society persisted throughout the Roman period, often in modified forms that allowed them to coexist with Roman institutions. Tribal territories often became the basis for Roman administrative districts. Tribal leaders became Roman magistrates, and Celtic religious practices were incorporated into the syncretic religious culture of Roman Britain. The transformation of British tribal society under Roman rule was neither complete nor uniform, with many modern county boundaries in England and Wales reflecting ancient tribal territories. In the more Romanized areas of southern and eastern Britain, tribal identities gradually gave way to a more cosmopolitan Romano-British culture that combined elements of both traditions. However, in the more remote regions of Wales, northern England, and Scotland, tribal structures and identities remained much stronger throughout the Roman period and beyond. The legacy of these pre-Roman tribal kingdoms extends far beyond their military resistance to Roman conquest. The territorial boundaries established by these tribes often influenced later political divisions, but rather the response of proud and independent societies to foreign domination. The cultural traditions preserved and adapted by these tribes contributed to the distinctive character of Romano-British civilization, and provided foundations for the kingdoms that would emerge after the collapse of Roman authority in Britain. Understanding these tribal kingdoms also provides crucial insight into the complexity and sophistication of pre-Roman British society. Far from being primitive barbarians, as Roman propaganda often portrayed them, these were complex societies with sophisticated political structures, advanced technologies, extensive trade networks, and rich cultural traditions. Their resistance to Roman rule was not simply the reaction of savage peoples to civilization. The stories of leaders like Boudica, Caratacus, and Venusius remind us that the Roman conquest of Britain was not inevitable or equally accomplished. It required decades of military campaigning, enormous expenditures of resources, and constant adaptation to local conditions and resistance strategies. The courage and determination of British tribal warriors forced Rome to commit some of its best legions to British campaigns, and influenced Roman military tactics and strategy throughout the empire. The tribal kingdoms of pre-Roman Britain represent a fascinating chapter in European history, one that demonstrates the diversity and complexity of Celtic civilization at its height. Their struggles against Roman expansion illustrate universal themes of resistance to foreign domination, the tension between accommodation and defiance in the face of overwhelming power, and the ways in which cultural identity can persist, even under conditions of political subjugation. These forgotten warriors and their kingdoms deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes to Roman history. Subscribe for more deep dives into the wild past. Comment below. Which tribe would you have joined? Iceni, Brigantes, or Cartamandua's crew? But as representatives of a rich and sophisticated civilization that made its own unique contributions to the cultural heritage of Britain, their legacy lives on in the landscape they shaped, the boundaries they established, the traditions they preserved, and the example they set of courage in the face of impossible odds. If you made it this far, you've earned your chariot, warrior. Like this video if ancient tribal warfare gets your blood pumping. This has been I'll Tell You What Happened, where forgotten warriors ride again.